Hey everyone, hey and welcome back to yet another episode of Watching the Watchmen podcast. This is your host Tom Kwei. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have a very, very special guest, but of course, as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Deff. How's it going, man?
Yeah, really good. Really big thing for the podcast about to happen. So I'm very excited to get into this.
Yeah.
But my mind's racing with questions,
Yeah.
but I'll try and keep it to a minimum.
And, I want to say, as I always do, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review on iTunes, get in touch with us as well, watchingthewatchmenpod@gmail.com. If you've got any feedback of any of our reviews, or you want any questions for us, I want to say thank you to everyone that sent in questions for today's guest as well. Yeah, we're also on Twitter, that's a new thing, @WatchmenPod. But incredibly excited to say that I've got we've got the colorist from Watchmen, Mr. John Higgins. John, how are you, sir?
Hi Tom, hi Deff, how are you? Hi everyone else who's listening.
Amazing to have you on, really. I'm sure as everyone listening knows that you are, one part of the trivium that created Watchmen and many, many other things. And again, it's great to have you on the show, John. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. It give me an opportunity to talk about myself or Watchmen. I'll jump to the chance.
Brilliant, yeah. Kind of starting off with everything. I know you originally began your career as a medical illustrator for Royal Marsden's NHS Foundation Trust. So how did you really transfer into comics and art and colouring? It seems like quite a big leap to go from one thing to the other.
I think, have you been reading my book, by the way? Because that's the information in my book, which is Beyond Watchmen and Judge Dredd. So if people have been looking at my book, they can check out my answers. Make sure I'm not reading for the book as well.
We'll put the link below.
Yeah. But the great thing for me, so like when I was at art college, one of the things, a group of people there were really into comics. I'd left them a long time in the past, but I rediscovered them mainly through American underground comics. So this is in the mid-70s. And so like to a certain extent, I wanted to get to science fiction book cover illustration. And really in those days, because there was no internet, there was no way of connecting with publishers except basically face-to-face or by phone, I needed to travel to London. And I was offered a job at the Royal Marsden Hospital because one of the courses I did at art college was medical illustration. So for me, the opportunity to be working in the centre of the publishing capital of Britain was a great opportunity for me to take that step, and it worked out obviously perfectly.
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy, really. I mean, like during the mid-'80s, you're kind of heralded as one of the forerunners of the British invasion. What was it like at this time? Are there any key things you remember, or was there any struggles kind of breaking America?
Well, I think for me the great thing was because when I first moved to London, it was like probably 77, something like that. And I think everyone probably knows that comics history, British comics history, in 2000 AD started in 1977. So I moved to London just for me when it was a perfect opportunity to start looking at comics as an alternative to doing science fiction book covers or medical illustration. So to get into comics, I started to socialize with people who, obviously, if you go to like comic shops or comic marts, you start meeting people who have like-minded sensibilities. So I started meeting other people like Gary Leach, who's a brilliant comic artist, and because he was completely and utterly focused on getting into comics more than anything else. He did book covers as well, but comics were his forte. That's what he dreamed about and lived and breathed. So mixing with like people like Gary Leach gave me an idea there was a possibility that there was a job for me in comics. And I started doing stuff for 2000 AD, just little spot illustrations here and there. So mixing with like people like Gary Leach, and then obviously if you started to work for 2000 AD, you started like seeing obviously Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons, and I worked with Alan Moore a lot of times. So by the mid-'80s, I was starting to move more into comics than in book covers, science fiction book covers. So I started sort of like mixing with the people who did go first, like, Brian Bolland did Camelot 3000, and Alan Moore was writing stuff. I think Brian was probably the first person. And then as far as I know, Dave was the second person to start working full-time for American publishers. So the mid-'80s was just about right for me because one, as I said, had started establishing myself in British comics, and I was starting to be employed full-time as a comic artist rather than doing science fiction book covers. So, but at that time, it was a bit of everything. I was doing anything that came in, particularly, as you know, if you're self-employed and freelance, I just wanted to work, so I was doing anything that came in.
I must say, John, that I love your cover, 2000 AD, for number 43, the Dial M for Monster cover. You know, a fantastic one that I'm sure a lot of people are aware of. And you know, where did this start? You and Alan and Dave getting together. There was a meeting in the Royal Oak pub in the West End of London. Was that right? As one of the impetuses for Watchmen? Yeah,
that's a great thing. So, you know, again, it's one of the things I do say when I give talks and interviews. It's probably a lot harder now to get into comics and illustration generally. The internet is a window. You know, you go anywhere in the world to a certain extent, but there's a million other people who want the same job as you. Whereas when I first started, as I said, you had to turn up on the day with your portfolio. So it was quite small in a way. And the opportunity to go out and see different publishers was probably bigger in a way, because nowadays most of the British publishers I work for, the book publishers anyway, they all now are taken under Transworld. They're all owned by either Penguin Books or Transworld. And there's, you know, in the old days, there used to be 10 or 20 different science fiction book publishers in London. Yeah. So they were great to go to. So people like Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons and those guys who were working for 2000 AD, I was taking on lots of different work. But because 2000 AD was all black and white, or mainly black and white, people like Dave was asking me to do some colouring because they knew I was doing book covers and fully painted work. So their interest wasn't necessarily in the colouring side of it, and you can't suddenly learn a skill overnight if you were offered a job. I mean, one of the jobs I did with Steve Dillon was an advertising job, and we both got really well paid. You know, it's £600 each, should we say. Whereas when you do a comic page, black and white line, so it was only £120. So the idea of me coming in and helping people doing the colouring was seemed like a logical step to everyone who wasn't doing colouring for themselves. So talking to Dave and Alan in particular, or Dave in particular, Dave was the person who really got me into doing the Watchmen. And I can't remember if I did any work before for American publishers. I probably hadn't. So probably Dave was more than anything was the reason I'm working for America, or certainly working for the American publishers in the mid 1980s. So yeah, it's definitely Dave, and yeah.
So when you're kind of talking about how you had to learn to do colouring, and I know that a lot of your work is sometimes quite abstract. For example, in Watchmen, there's lots of pages that are just flashes of red, and I love the way that you use colour to kind of invoke emotion as well. We noticed that in the Black Freighter, there's certain colour choices there that really are very striking and kind of unorthodox. How do you compose the colour palette for a book? Do you create one to begin with, or does it sort of evolve with the book as it grows?
I think the great thing for colour is the fact that certainly nowadays, because the subtlety of computer colouring, you can do anything from 5% grey to 100% red, and and combine so many different elements. But when we did the Watchmen, because it was printed traditionally with the old letterpress colour, 4-colour separated plates, I had to use colour in a way that it wasn't naturalistic. Whereas if I was trying to colour the way most traditional colorists were doing in those days, it would have been, the sky would have been blue, the grass would have been green, trees would have been brown, and people's faces would have been pink. I wanted to when I was at art college, I read a book called The Psychology of Perception, and they had a very large section on colour and emotional responses to colour. So talking with Dave in particular, and because Alan had written about colour right from, he wanted certain scenes using certain colours. So I had to make a combination of using colour not just decoratively, but also to try and engender some sensible emotional response to it. I mean, we all know that like red is danger, and to a certain extent we respond very positively when we see a red sign or we see a red sunset even. So my thinking, based on what I knew about the psychological aspect of colour, was to use colour in that way. And I think I probably was I was the first to use it like that in comics anyway.
So kind of talking about how Moore gave you ideas, he's quite famous for writing very grandiose notes, sort of detailing each panel. Do you get similar ones for the colouring of the book, or did you have more free reign over it than Gibbons had?
No, thank God I didn't have the script that Dave
Yeah.
I'm assuming most people have seen the annotated script that Dave has published a number of times, and the detail that he had to highlight. And, you know, even though Alan was a stunning writer, sort of, you don't necessarily need to put all that detail in. The fact that Dave managed to evoke what Alan was writing was just, I never get tired of saying what a phenomenal combination of talent the Watchmen is. You know, Dave and Alan. I don't think anyone's interpreted Alan as well as Dave has ever before or since. You know, even so like Kev O'Neill, who's been a regular, collaborator with Alan all these years. I think for me, Dave, that synthesis of Dave and Alan is just mind-blowing. So yeah, thankfully I didn't get that sort of detail. There's only a couple of scenes that Alan had particularly thought about. I mean, when Rorschach is walking to Morlock's apartment, he wanted a flashing neon light because he was living in a very sleazy part of New York, and so he wanted the foot of Rorschach to be splashing into a puddle, reflecting, you know, the nightclub next door.
Yeah.
So there's little details like that he wrote about, but the colour combinations, I don't think even Alan could have written sort of like colour combinations in a way that would have helped me in any way.
Yeah, give you loads of hex codes and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it just would have driven me mad, and probably would have driven him even madder than he is now. So,
yeah.
And if you can just give us a sort of layman's breakdown of how it would work, you actually colouring something, when you would receive something to work on, how long you would spend on it for Watchmen.
I think for me, the great thing, because I lived so close to Dave, we talked about it a lot. And it's like, even if he wouldn't say to me, I wanted to colour this way, you know, as long as there was a key to something, I could revolve everything else around it. When I decided to use colour as an emotional signpost, should we say, because the murder scene of the comedian comes very, very soon in flashback in the first chapter, because I knew the red and the very striking magentas and the pinks were going to be used in that way, and then we counterpointed those bright, violent colours against the flashback to the two detectives, where they were cooler and more muted. Once you have sort of like something that's giving you a key to starting off the whole book, should we say, which is literally that. For me, it was the scene with the comedian. Once I knew I was going to use red in that way, then I was trying to use those sort of violent colours when there was violence scenes. Yeah. So that was a key to me, and then everything else then fell in place, because if with the funeral scene, we did very muted colours, very dark, sort of like blues and greys, and the grass was very muted. It wasn't a bright green grass and things like that. So that sort of like counterpoint was something that made the story flow. And talking with Dave about the script constantly, you know, and we met up quite regularly, probably, well, more than most colourists would ever meet their artists ever, because we were socially enjoying it. So I might have met him once or twice in the month, rather than like just meeting him when I was colouring, when I was being given the colour, or when I was colouring it. So to do a page of that was actually probably a page a day of colouring. So, you know, it's like 28 pages. I think it was 28 pages. So 28 pages would take almost a month. Some pages would be faster, some pages would take a bit longer. But it was the notations for the printers that were the biggest problem. I don't know if you guys or your audience have seen how those colour markups had to be supplied to the printers, but we had to write down all the individual colour percentages, Y2,
really?
And all that sort of stuff. And that really, I hated that more than anything. And so I tended to leave that to the very end of the colouring job. So probably about a page a day or half a day to do each page, depending on what the scene was. If I'd already set the scene, because we had lots of flashbacks, so if we were showing Rorschach in one particular flashback, or if we were showing the comedian in a flashback, I'd already created those scenes. So we either recreated or just noted to the printers to actually drop in that panel. So there are ways of saving time, but it was quite intensive.
Yeah, I can imagine. This is like sort of a more controversial question. I've actually got a friend who's been reading comics from the 50s, and I was talking to him about like the way that things are getting reprinted now. And we've just seen that Watchmen Noir has been released. Do you harbor any sort of bad feelings towards them just releasing a black and white version of it? Because I kind of think that it takes away from the work itself. Like Watchmen is very much striking yellows and reds and purples, and to have those colors muted to me just seems like you're kind of getting, I don't know, half the book almost.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. But no, I'm really pleased to see it. I mean, I think the lovely thing is I'm a huge fan of Dave's work. I've always have been before we started working together. And to see, because I was obviously one of the only people to see his black and white line work before it was, coloured up.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased to see, it's out there. And plus the fact it gives Dave Gibbons a great opportunity to wind me up every time he waves one of them at me. And plus the fact I actually keep saying to people, I can give you a set of felt tip pens if you want to go and colour it yourself. I think I was reading a review, or how many times they've repackaged the Watchmen, and some of the repackaging of the Absolute Edition obviously being quite stunning, because you got the opportunity to digitally colour it, and we got rid of a number of things that we didn't particularly like in 1986. So the Absolute Edition is the best you can get. But when they do all these different repackaging, I have no problem with it, because the more they sell, the more Dave and I and Alan earn. So with that. But there was a review sort of like saying, how many different ways can you repackage the Watchmen? And it is becoming slightly diminishing returns, I think. I think the repackaging is quite stunning. And I think there's no way one person will own every single republished edition of Watchmen, because it's just so many of them. But the great thing for me is not only as a contributor to the Watchmen, but also as a fan of the Watchmen. And that will never ever change, because I always find something new in it. But every time I go to conventions, I'll see a new set of fans coming with a new edition of Watchmen. So the fans from 40 and up. And I just love that, So there's a new generation every couple of years. There's a new generation of Watchmen fans, which is brilliant.
Yeah, you must have been so incredibly proud of it, because, me and Def and millions of others around the world extol how incredible. How did you feel about it being included on Time Magazine's 100 Best Novels?
Oh, I think it was not a vindication. I think, if you're a comics fan, you understand that comics come with literature. But I think for me, it was just brilliant to for the wider world to actually see that comics are literature, or can be literature. You have the extremes, pulp horror, superhero stuff, and even that can transcend into, great stories. But the fact that the Watchmen's straddled, murder mystery and superhero emotional responses to relationships was just, it was just brilliant to be recognised. I was just blown away by that.
Yeah, it's really intriguing just how well it's kind of transcended the genre. And kind of tying into that, I saw an interview on the Victoria Gallery where he discussed how there's no real difference now between fine art and popular modern art. Do you think that the lines are being blurred across the board due to adaptation? So, for example, superhero comics are now kind of bleeding into movies and TVs. I mean, a lot of movies could be viewed as a piece of art. Like I watched Blade Runner 2049 today, and I just think it's incredible. Do you think there's like still a clear division between media, or is it all part of one collective of like creative consciousness?
I do go to different sorts of conventions. I go to science fiction conventions and obviously comic conventions in particular, but it's amazing how some people's perceptions, like a lot of science fiction, there is a crossover in science fiction and comics, but you do find there's a hardcore of science fiction readers, or SF readers, should we say, who really turn the nose up at, like, you know, the lowest like edge of like what comics are about, you know. So I think people would just automatically just dismiss them and not give them a chance at all. But it's like people of intelligence, perception and depth like we are, and all our listeners, you know, we know it's like there's no crossover anymore. It's like great science fiction, great comics, even great like superhero you know, movies by Marvel. It's like, you know, they're just entertaining, and something can cross over into art. I mean, as you say, it's like, you know, the latest Blade Runner, you know, Blade Runner is my #1 movie of all time. You know, it's always been my top 10. It's always been #1. And Blade Runner 2049 is just very close second now. It's just so good. It's pure art. I mean, the director of that was sort of like saying, for some reason, it wasn't as massive a success as I believe it should have been, and probably you believe it should have been.
Yeah.
Because the director was saying in an interview in Empire magazine that he made the most expensive art house movie ever. You know, it's just brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I think the culture is a way now, because through the internet, I mean, people can pick and choose. Whereas in the past, when I first came into science fiction or comics, we felt part of a cult, you know, and you know, we felt part of its cult entertainment or cult literature. Now it's like it's worldwide. We just click on, we can find thousands, probably millions of other people who love something very similar to what we do. Whenever I go to international conventions around the world, the thing that I love most is like seeing what the homegrown comics are about. And sadly, in one way, it's like a lot of it is their version of American superheroes, which I find slightly depressing. But you know, it's in way, comics now is an international language, and I'm blessed to be part of that wave.
And speaking of cinema, of course, there was the Watchmen film. Did you have any involvement in that at all?
No, it's like Dave asked me if I wanted to like come along and get involved with talking about doing press interviews and stuff like that, because he's such an incredibly generous collaborator and friend. But I had no real interest in that, and this was probably 2009, I think, when it came out. Was it 2009?
2009, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like they were doing all the promotion and pre-publicity. It's like a year or so before, and I really wasn't up to public speaking in those days. I mean, 10 years, obviously, almost 10 years have passed now, and I'm a bit more used to it for one reason or another. Obviously, I do quite a bit more now. But what I enjoyed, and I still enjoy, is like, you know, sitting in my studio, drawing and telling stories, and that's what my driving force is, my driving creativity. Dave has sort of like almost transcended his roots as a comic artist. You know, he was made Comics Laureate last year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I think it was. I think Charlie Adlard was last year's, and I think Dave was the first one, and that was I don't know, issued, commissioned, or, you know, he was crowned the laureate in the Lakes 2016 maybe. I forgot what year it is, but anyway, yes, so he's doing a lot of promotion for comics, and to a certain extent, because of Kingsman as well, he's gone from Watchmen success onto lots of other success, and Kingsman in a way is probably one of the most commercial, successful things he's done with Mark Miller. So to a certain extent, he's almost transcended his roots, as I said. So, you know, he doesn't necessarily need to work. I still need to work. So
yeah, and like Watchmen sort of transcended its roots now a bit with Doomsday Clock. One of my big criticisms of that is that the color, it's sort of coloured to look photorealistic, but obviously a lot of people prefer that style now. Do you prefer like the more pulp colouring in comic books, or is the realistic colour palette more what you aim for now?
We tend to aim for more naturalistic colours now, I think, to a certain extent, because my partner, my wife, she's now my colourist, so I tend to do the black and white line, and the I give her sort of colour advice, but she tends to be my colourist now. So Sally Jane Higgins is my colourist, which seems weird because probably more people know me in the world for colouring The Watchmen and The Killing Joke than doing like all the thousands of pages of Judge Dredd line art I've done. But so the sort of stuff that we do now tends to be quite muted and quite realistic because that tends to be modern style. At the moment, I'm actually like doing probably my favourite job. Well, it's actually my favourite job in a very long time because last year we spent more or less just promoting the exhibition in Liverpool, which is just finished this year. It's on the Victoria Museum, and I think you you went to see it, Tom?
No, I haven't seen it actually. No, I went to the University of Liverpool myself, but I missed it. I would have loved to have gone.
Yeah, well, I was blown away by how they presented it, and going back to the interview you saw me doing with the university was the fact that what the curator did, like Leonie Stedman, who is the curator, she sort of like looked at how to present it in a way that's like, fitted the gallery. And it's a fine art gallery. The Victoria Gallery Museum in Liverpool is one of the best galleries, I believe, in Britain. And to be shown there was a crowning moment in my career. But I did very, very little work, paid work, shall we say. It's like my job, which is drawing comics for a living and telling stories. And I spent a lot of time doing workshops and presentations and stuff in Liverpool, which is brilliant because it's my hometown. But coming back now, which is what I've done now, I've been working non-stop for it finished in February, the exhibition. And since February, what year? It's February now, isn't it?
Still just February, yeah.
Just about.
That's right, yes. Well, I went up for the last time at the beginning of February when it finished. But before that, the last workshop we did was probably October. So anyway, I've been working non-stop for about 3 months on the latest thing I'm doing for 2000 AD magazine, which is Judge Dredd and Razorjack. My character is called Razorjack. And obviously Judge Dredd, everyone knows Judge Dredd. And we're doing a crossover with my character, my favourite character, which is Judge Dredd. So at the moment, we're just having so much fun. And the thing that I'm enjoying about this is I'm colouring a lot more of this with Sally. We're doing a very tight crossover in this, whereas the last job we did, which was for 2000 AD, was Grey Suit, and that was very mute and very realistic. Because Judge Dredd is science fiction, pure science fiction, and Razorjack is science fiction as well, I'm allowed to go to town on the colours, and that's the thing I love about science fiction in a way, because you can make it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be naturalistic. So I definitely recommend everyone to pick it up in May when it comes out. We're just right in the middle of it at the moment. So the colouring we're doing for that is quite striking and very, very science fiction-ish, I suppose. And that's probably why I went into science fiction anyway, because I love those sort of colours.
Yeah.
For me, I don't know, you guys, you're way too young to remember Bruce Pennington maybe, but Bruce Pennington was one of the best science fiction artists next to Chris Foss in Britain, in the world, as far as I'm concerned. But his colours were just so striking and so visually, an immediate impact. You could see the book cover across the bookstore as soon as you walked in. So that's where I came from. I came from like using colour in a way to one, attract attention, but also to get an emotional response. So I'll use whatever's required, really.
Yeah, and kind of going back to the Killing Joke that you mentioned there, and we actually analysed the book for our mid-season break, and we kind of went into it, like one of the big controversial aspects of it is the recolouring. I did actually say on the podcast that I actually prefer the original colouring. I mean, I'm not just kissing your ass. It's been I've recorded it, I've written it down, and I think it kind of adds to the zany characterizations a lot more. Without kind of digging up too much dirt or throwing anyone under the bus, how does the recolouring sit with you? Did you pick it up, or do you just kind of think, oh well, someone's just doing a different take on my own work?
It means nothing to me. It's, as you said, the thing is, it was a bit of a surprise to me, because when I walked into my local bookstore, when the recolored edition came out, you know, you just look at all the graphic novels, and one of the pleasures for me was seeing my name underneath Alan and Brian's, you know, John Higgins Colourist. So, well, John Higgins with the three of us there, and I went in and didn't see my name. I thought, what the heck's going on here? Or words to that effect. And looked inside, and obviously it was all muted and modern-ish, should we say. And it's not my colouring, so it does not mean anything to me. I don't fault Brian for doing it, because he wanted to do it originally, but because he was so slow, I was brought into the mix, because they wanted to get the book out and published, you know, when it's like Alan was hot and Brian was, you know, taking so long to do the line artwork, and as beautiful as it is, you know, the bottom line is you need something to be published before people can appreciate how good it is. Yeah. So I wanted to do my colouring job, and because I just finished Watchmen, you know, I knew how to get an emotional response from the colouring I was trying to do. And because the Killing Joke, I read the Killing Joke as being from the Joker's perspective. You know, I felt this like it was a Joker who was like driving the whole story, and, you know, it was his story, even though it was like the Dark Knight. You know, he's the main character, should we say, certainly the hero that we all root for. So I coloured it the way I perceived the way it would be. And plus the fact, I mean, you can't do a muted grey like fairground, surely, you know. So anyway, all the things for me dictated the way I approached the colouring, and what I'd learnt on Watchmen to get an emotional response from the reader was to use those sort of colours. I didn't really read what was being said about it, or thank you for saying what you did say, Tom, and I don't necessarily listen to what people were saying about it online, because it was a job I did, you know, 20 odd years ago, 30 odd years ago. But I've just written an article about it. I was asked to write my version of, like, you know, that particular time, and I did a bit of research online just to see what other people said, and I read a couple of very nice things about what people appreciated about my colouring rather than what Brian had done for his colouring. So I feel, you know, if it splits people 50-50, then that's fine. If it splits people more to me, that's fine. Or I don't really mind either way. I mean, I think the great thing is you have the opportunity to, like, see Brian's approach from the Dark Knight, see people, you know, from the Joker's perspective. So I think it's just incredible. I can't wait to see them combine it one day in the Absolute Edition.
Yeah, I suppose it is quite meta, really, because the Joker talks about how his past is sort of multiple choice, and now you kind of have a multiple choice for the colours of the book.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, good for you for picking that up. That's a very nice, very clever of you. Yeah. My goodness.
That's what we do here, John. We'll close up with a few quick emails that we've gotten from some fans. So, first of all, from Eric Ferguson, who is a great fan of the show, always sending in some excellent emails. His first question for you, John, was whose choice was it to make Ozymandias' costume purple? It was an instant giveaway that he was the villain, as only villains use purple.
All right. Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that question, and the nice thing is I can blame Dave Gibbons for that. Right. When we sat down and talked about what we wanted, Dave did have an idea of a number of things that he did want. He knew Rorschach's colouring, obviously Night Owl, and yeah, he wanted the gold and the purple, like royalty, particularly because not necessarily Ozymandias, sort of like he was talking about, you know, past Alexander the Great and royalty and stuff. So there was that combination. So like, and he was, you know, obviously he had feelings of grandeur, should we say. He wanted to save the world. So the royalty aspect and the purple came together, I suppose. So I didn't necessarily think it was a finger pointing at a villain, but yeah, he turned out to be the villain.
Yeah. And is there anything, again, Eric asking here, is there something that you've added to Watchmen that's not commonly known?
Actually, one of the things in my book, which I have pointed out in detail, the great for me is like the exhibition in Liverpool gave me the opportunity to do an autobiographical art book, and I got the opportunity to like put my point of view from my perspective completely and utterly, with no one else, no editing or anything. So if you want to read the ins and outs, if you go for my book, which I'm turning around because I can't remember what it's called, but it's Beyond Watchmen and Judge Dredd, The Art of John Higgins, with a foreword by Dave Gibbons, so obviously we're still friends. Yeah. But I go in detail in there. There's a couple of things in there that I point out that I did in Watchmen that I think I find interesting. I don't know if we have time to talk about it now, but when the hand separators in those days had to do a certain effect, they used their thumbprints, and when we did the Absolute Edition, I could have done a complete airbrush effect and very smooth digitally, but I actually recreated what we originally did in 1986 just because I was so proud of those unsung heroes who hand-sepped all the colours for the original printing. So that's something that you should look out for, and that's when Dr. Manhattan comes back as Dr. Manhattan for the first time. If you look at the glow around him, you'll see fingerprints.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So if you look in the Absolute Edition and if you look in the original edition, in the Absolute Edition, they're my fingerprints. If you look in the original edition, it's some unknown perp in hand-sepped country in America somewhere. So that's a hidden.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And last question from Eric. He says that Alan Moore has said something to the effect that the medium of comics is great, but much of the writing leaves something to be desired. Where does colouring need to go, or go to achieve within the medium? Where do you want to see it go?
I actually think with digital colouring now, we can do anything we want. We can sort of like do watercolour effects, fully painted effects, oil paint effects, or we can do airbrush effects, which is the thing that I always want to do. So I think we've actually achieved with colour probably a lot of what everyone else is still striving for in comics. And the bottom line is it's always in the eye of the beholder. To a certain extent, an individual artist will have their key signature that people really love or hate. And, that's the medium that we have, which I think is just brilliant. People will appreciate what you do because you bring something new into the mix. I think for writers it's a lot harder because it's easier to judge art than to look at a script or to read a comic book. Sometimes they have to play the mean games like in the middle, trying not to alienate people. The great thing about people like Alan Moore and Mark Millar and a lot of other British writers, and Frank Miller when he was doing it to the height of his abilities, these people take risks. And I think sometimes, certainly with the main publishers, Marvel and DC, I probably think Marvel are more to blame than DC at this, but they tend to play safe. And particularly now they've been bought out by Disney, it's right. I think it's getting quite bland now, and particularly because I don't think Mark is writing for them anymore, and Michael Bendis has gone to DC. So,
yeah,
I think it's up to the writers to lift their game. But I think the opportunity at the moment, with digital in particular, even if people are inking digitally, we can do some really fascinating stuff now digitally. So, I think it's good time in comics.
Last question, last email from Mark Andrew Nordstrom, who's been getting in touch with the show a lot as well. You sort of touched on this with Watchmen Noir, but question for Johnny says, what was your experience with the Zender French edition of the Watchmen cover prints as signature plates? Considering the French covers are black and white, do you enjoy seeing them that way, or does it feel naked without the life that your colours add?
Oh, as I said, it's like with the Watchmen Noir. I just love Dave's artwork. I got the opportunity to recolour the black plates that Dave did specially for the advertising promotion, before Watchmen came out. And I think they were for the Americans. I think they did. I can't remember. I think they just did black and white ads in the regular comic. Before it came out. And Dave did an incredible series of very mature and very sort of like teaser sort of illustrations. I got the opportunity to colour them. And that was a great opportunity for me to do that. But I just love Dave's artwork. When he was doing Watchmen, it was just when everything came, I think, for me, everything came together with Dave. He had the enthusiasm, the energy, and the ability to do that sort of artwork. And I can't believe anyone would actually have done it any better than he could have done it. So I'm just a huge fan of seeing his black and white line work. So I'm quite happy just to look at this black and white line.
Yeah.
But if someone pays me to colour it, I'm very happy to colour it.
And out of interest, Alan Moore, do you speak to him at all? Have you spoken to him recently, like with Dave, or?
No, I haven't spoken. We saw him about 2 years ago, I think. But other than that, no, he tends to not really leave Northampton anymore.
Yeah.
I think he does do signings still in Orbital, but I think there's very few places he goes out to. So, yeah, I haven't seen him for about 2 years, which is a shame.
Yeah.
Very interesting person, even now. I loved it in the early days when we just used to go out and get drink and other substances, maybe. Days are just great fun. It was just brilliant when you guys are probably the same. When you first start out, you're just mixing with people you want to mix with. And the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Any closing questions, Steph?
No. Been a brilliant episode. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No.
Is there anything you want to promote, or
John,
you've mentioned your book a couple of times?
Your website. Is there anything people should check out in terms of links, or?
No, just check out the artofjohnhiggins.com. Other than that, it's just really nice to talk to you guys. Thank you very much for having me on.
No, it's been
pleasure's all ours.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks to everyone for listening as well. John, this has been a treat. You know, you've created something that me and Def, idolise, and millions of other people around the world. So, just again, thank you so much, John.
You're more than welcome. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Do it again.